Damien Ashford had spent 36 days on this godforsaken planet, 36 days of suffocating humidity, perpetual hunger, and the relentless gnawing silence of being the last one left. Delta V-47 had been a routine reconnaissance mission until it wasn't. The Terran Recon Corps had sent the Argos to skin the planet for viable resources, assess its climate, and confirm reports of unexplained signatures. Nothing too unusual, nothing out of the ordinary until halfway through descent. A magnetar surge erupted from the surface like a silent explosion, frying every system on the ship in an instant. 1 second the crew was locked into their landing sequence. The next alarm screamed, metal shrieked, and the sky was on fire. Damien had barely made it to an escape pod before Argos was torn apart. The last transmission he heard from his team was Captain Vance's voice, distorted by static, shouting orders to abandon ship. Then silence. No wreckage, no distress beacons, no bodies. No one. He was alone. For the first week he had searched. He had moved methodically across the jungle-covered terrain, following the rough trajectory of the crash site, hoping to find some sign, any sign of the others. But Delta V-47 was vast, and every step into its depths was another step toward exhaustion. The jungle was a predator's paradise, thick with massive carnivorous flora and nocturnal hunters whose glowing eyes tracked him from the trees. Survival became his priority, but even as he scavenged, even as he built makeshift weapons and found shelter among the ruins of fallen trees, the question haunted him: what happened to the others? The planet had swallowed them whole, and it would do the same to him if he let it. Then he heard the scream. It was distant but raw, echoing through the trees like a blade against steel. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It was something thinking, something suffering. Damon's fingers tightened around the crude spear he had fashioned from salvaged wreckage. He had heard enough dying things in his life to know that whoever or whatever was out there didn't have long. And despite everything, despite all telling him to turn away, he moved. The jungle closed around him, branches scraping against his arms, thick roots twisting beneath his feet. He navigated the terrain with practiced ease, his breath controlled, his focus narrowing as the cries became sharper, more desperate. Then he saw her. She was trapped, her body tense with pain, her tail pinned beneath the weight of a fallen rock. But that wasn't what made Damon freeze. She was stunning, otherworldly. Her skin was a deep, muted violet, smooth as polished obsidian beneath the soft glow of the twin moons. Her hair, long and untamed, cascaded around her in wild waves of pure white, and her ears, tall, fox-like, furred, twitched at the slightest sound, attuned to the dangers of the jungle. But it was her tail that caught his eye. It was massive, thick with dense fur and cream and light brown hues, curling involuntarily as she struggled to free herself. It reminded him of an Arctic predator, a hunter designed to move with silent grace, its every feature crafted for precision. But now she was injured, and she knew he was there. Her golden eyes locked onto him, sharp and assessing, the pain momentarily overshadowed by something colder, a warning. She bared her teeth, not in desperation but in defiance. Damon stopped moving. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who refused to be seen as weak even when they were suffering. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice even. Her ears twitched, her gaze flickering to his hands, assessing if he was a threat. She spoke, her voice rough with strain, her accent unfamiliar yet intriguingly melodic. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the message. Stay back. Damon didn't move closer, not yet. His instincts told him that any sudden movement would turn this from a tense standoff into a bloody one. But her tail twitched again, subtle pain. She was losing strength. He exhaled, shifting his stance slightly, keeping his movement slow. "You can hate me later," he muttered, "but right now you need me." A flicker of hesitation passed through her golden eyes, but she said nothing. Damon crouched beside the rock, studying the weight, the angle, the way it had crushed part of the ground beneath it. He didn't waste time talking. He simply dug his hands under the cold, jagged edges and pushed. The weight resisted, pressing into his bones like an immovable force. His arms trembled, his boots sank deeper into the soft earth. He growled through clenched teeth, pushed harder. The rock shifted. The alien woman gasped, her claws digging into the dirt as she tried to move. One more heave. Damon let out a strained roar of effort, and the rock rolled free, slamming into the ground with a dull, resounding thud. For a moment, neither of them moved. She exhaled sharply, curling her tail toward herself, her fingers brushing over the spot where the weight had crushed it. Her shoulders trembled, but not from fear, from relief. Damon took a step back, hands raised. See? No harm done. She didn't thank him. She didn't say anything. Instead, she just stared at him, not with hostility anymore, but with calculated curiosity. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared into the jungle. Damien watched her go, his muscles still burning from the effort, his heart hammering from the sheer intensity of it all. Something in his gut told him this wasn't over. He glanced down. A few strands of pure white hair lay tangled in the dirt where she had been, and beside them, the faint imprint of clawed footprints, hesitant, lingering. Damon smirked, rolling his shoulders. "At least you didn't try to kill me," he muttered, shaking his head. Then, gripping his spear, he turned back toward the depths of the jungle. He wasn't alone on this planet, and neither was she. The jungle never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, it pulsed with life. Chittering insects, distant howls, the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. Damon had learned early on that silence was more dangerous than noise. Noise meant life. Silence meant something was hunting. He crouched by the fire, sharpening the edge of his makeshift knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The metal was salvaged from the wreckage of his escape pod, its once polished surface now darkened with wear. It wasn't much, but it had kept him alive. A storm was coming. He could feel it in the way the air thickened, the distant rumble of thunder beyond the treetops. The sky above was barely visible through the dense canopy, but flashes of pale blue light flickered between the gaps. Delta V-47's version of lightning, eerily silent, illuminating the jungle like ghosts dancing in the mist. He would need a fine shelter soon. He stood, rolling his shoulders, adjusting the straps of the small satchel he carried, his lifeline, filled with what little food he had scavenged. A few strips of dried meat, a handful of fruit with tough, bitter skins, but enough nutrients to keep him going. His supplies were running low. He had been forced further and further from his usual hunting grounds, and that was dangerous. The deeper he went, the less he understood this place. The memory of her hadn't left his mind. The alien woman, the way she had stared at him. Golden eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Not just suspicion, calculation. She hadn't attacked, hadn't spoken once the rock was lifted, but she had lingered, just for a moment. Then she was gone. He didn't know what to make of her. He had encountered nothing intelligent since he'd crashed, no signs of civilization or technology. Was she native to this planet, or was she just as stranded as he was? The questions nagged at him, but survival came first. Damon adjusted his grip on the spear and moved. His instincts carried him north, toward higher ground where the terrain became rockier, the jungle thinning just enough to let in slivers of pale moonlight. He had mapped this area before. If he kept going, he would reach the cliffs where the air was cooler, the land more open, a good place to wait out the storm. He had made it halfway up the ridge when the scent hit him. Blood, faint but fresh, carried by the shifting wind. It wasn't human. The scent was sharper, muskier, tinged with something almost metallic. And it was close. Damon's grip tightened on his spear as he followed the trail, keeping low, scanning the shadows. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from something deeper, something trained into him long ago. A body lay at the base of a slanted rock. Not just anybody. Her Zisha. She was slumped against the stone, one hand pressed to her side, her breathing uneven. Her long white hair was tangled with leaves and dirt, her massive furred tail twitching weakly. The golden glow of her eyes had dulled, her pupils blown wide. Damon's chest tightened. She had been injured. For a split second, he hesitated. If she woke and saw him standing over her, there was no telling how she would react. But then she let out a sharp, pained breath, her body tensing, and Damon moved. He crouched beside her, setting his spear down, hands hovering over her wounds. Blood, dark, nearly black, seeped between her fingers. Not a deep wound, but it wasn't superficial either. A gash along her ribs, jagged, like something had torn into her. A claw. A blade. Her ears flicked, a sharp intake of breath. She was waking up. Her eyes snapped open, locking onto him. And in an instant, she lunged. Damien caught her wrist before her claws could reach his throat, twisting just enough to hold her back but not hurt her. She was weak, weaker than she wanted to admit, but her strength was still there, coiled beneath the exhaustion. "Stop," he ordered, voice low, firm. "I'm not your enemy." She snarled, trying to wrench free, but the movement cost her. Pain flared across her face, her body faltering for just a second. Damien didn't let go. "You're bleeding." A flicker of hesitation crossed her features. Her golden eyes darted down to her own wound, then back to him. A silent calculation. Slowly she stopped fighting. Damon released her wrist, watching as she slumped back against the stone, still tense, still watching him like a cornered predator. He reached for his satchel, pulling out a strip of cloth. "I can help," he said simply. She said nothing, but she didn't stop him either. He tore the cloth, working quickly. She was still staring at him, but her gaze had changed. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was something deeper. She was trying to understand him. Damon pressed the fabric to her wound, tying it off with practiced precision. She inhaled sharply, but didn't flinch. "You're not from here," he said after a moment. It wasn't a question. Neither of them were. Zisha's eyes flickered, her expression unreadable, but then, for the first time, she spoke. "No." The single word carried weight, a confirmation, an admission. Damon exhaled, sitting back on his heels, studying her. The pieces were starting to come together. She was stranded, just like him. The storm rumbled overhead, creeping closer. "We need to move," Damon said, rising to his feet. He extended a hand, not demanding, not forcing, just offering. For a long moment, Zisha just stared at it. Then slowly she took it, her grip firm, fingers warm despite the cold night air as he pulled her up. She swayed slightly, but her tail flicked out to balance her. She was strong, stubborn. Damon smirked. This should be interesting. And together, they disappeared into the jungle, the storm chasing at their backs. The storm raged through the jungle, howling winds tearing through the treetops, shaking branches and sending sheets of warm rain cascading down in relentless waves. Damon led the way through the dense undergrowth, his grip firm around Zisha's wrist as they moved. She wasn't at full strength, her steps slightly uneven, but she was keeping pace, her golden eyes sharp despite the exhaustion weighing on her limbs. Her tail flicked behind her, heavy with dampness from the rain, the thick fur darkened by water. They needed shelter fast. Damon had mapped this area before, and he knew of a place, a rocky outcrop nestled between thick, rooted trees, naturally shielded from the worst of the elements. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep them from being exposed. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating Zisha's face in a stark, ghostly glow. She glanced at him, unreadable as ever, her wild white hair clinging to her face in wet strands. She wasn't saying much, but she didn't have to. She was studying him, calculating, just like she had when he freed her from the rock. The shelter came into view through the sheets of rain, an alcove of jagged stone jutting out from the hillside, just deep enough to block the wind. Without hesitation, Damon pulled Zisha inside, pressing himself against the rough wall as he scanned the jungle behind them. No immediate signs of danger, but that meant nothing. This planet thrived on ambushes. Zisha leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly, the tension in her shoulders finally easing now that they were out of the open. Damon turned to her, eyes dropping briefly to the hastily wrapped wound at her side. The fabric was soaked through with rain and blood, a dark stain spreading across the cloth. He crouched in front of her, shaking his head. "You're still bleeding." She made a sound in the back of her throat, something close to a scoff. "I know." Damon pulled a small blade from his belt, cutting away the drenched bandage. She didn't flinch, didn't move, only watched him with those piercing golden eyes. The wound was jagged, not deep enough to be fatal, but enough to slow her down. "This needs to be cleaned," he muttered, tearing another strip of dry cloth from his gear. He poured a bit of water onto it, wiping away the grime and blood. Zisha inhaled sharply at the contact, but said nothing. "You've done this before," she observed after a long silence. Finally, Zisha spoke. "Why did you help me?" Damien turned his head, raising an eyebrow. "The first time or this time?" "Both." He exhaled, tilting his head back against the rock. "Because leaving you there would have been wrong." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "That's simple." He gave her a look. "Why does it need to be complicated?" Zisha didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, lightly running her claws over the fresh bandage on her side, as if testing the tightness of the wrap. "In my culture," she said slowly, "when someone saves your life, you owe them a debt, a bond that must be repaid." Damon watched her carefully. "And you believe that?" She hesitated, just for a second. "Yes." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "So you owe me now." Zisha's ears flicked, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, not irritation. Amusement, Yes, she admitted. I do. Damon let out a breath, shaking his head. Great. So what does that mean for me? Zisha looked at him for a long moment before responding. It means I won't let you die. There was no sarcasm in her tone, no teasing, just fact. And somehow, Damon believed her. Another flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a low rumble of thunder. The jungle was restless tonight, but for the first time since he had crashed here, Damon didn't feel entirely alone. He wasn't sure what Zisha's presence meant yet, what she would do, where she would go, but he knew one thing for certain: they weren't enemies anymore, and that changed everything. The storm had passed, leaving behind a jungle damp with fresh rain. The scent of wet earth thick in the air. Water dripped from the canopy in slow, rhythmic droplets, pooling in the deep grooves of the tangled roots. A faint mist clung to the undergrowth, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. The sky, once an endless expanse of crackling lightning and howling winds, had calmed, revealing two moons hanging low, casting a pale silver light over the world below. Damon sat near the entrance of the rocky alcove, sharpening his blade with slow, practiced strokes. The fire in front of him flickered lazily, its embers glowing red against the damp stone walls. Across from him, Zisha sat with her back to the rock, one knee bent, her injured side still bandaged, but no longer bleeding. Her thick, furred tail curled loosely around her legs, its cream and light brown hues still damp from the rain. She hadn't said much since they'd stopped to rest, but she watched him in that same unreadable way, golden eyes tracking his movements as if trying to decipher something about him. He had gotten used to the feeling. Finally, she spoke. You do not belong here. Damon smirked, not looking up from his blade. No kidding. She tilted her head slightly, the faintest flicker of amusement crossing her features. And yet you are still alive. He paused, running his thumb over the edge of the blade to check its sharpness. I adapt. Zisha's ears twitched, a thoughtful motion. Most humans would not. Damien finally met her gaze, one brow raised. You've met a lot of humans, have you? Something shifted in her expression. Not quite anger, not quite sadness, but something close enough. Damon didn't press. He had learned long ago that some answers weren't given. They were earned. And Zisha wasn't the type to offer anything for free. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. You asked me why I helped you, he said after a moment. Zisha's tail flicked. Yes. He leaned back against the rock, stretching his legs out. I could ask you the same thing. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly. Damon gestured toward his wrapped arm, where faint bruises still lingered from when she had grabbed him the night before. You could have killed me when you woke up. You didn't. Zisha exhaled through her nose. You had already saved my life. To kill you then would have been dishonorable. Damon chuckled. Good to know you have a code. She gave him a look, but there was no real heat behind it. A breeze swept through the jungle, rustling the leaves, sending a wave of cool air through the alcove. Zisha's ears twitched at the sound, her posture shifting slightly. Damon watched her for a long moment before speaking again. Where were you? Before this? She hesitated. Before I was left here. He nodded. Zisha glanced away, staring at the fire. Among my people. In the fleet. Damien straightened slightly. Fleet, that meant ships, space, the possibility of rescue, of escape. She must have caught the change in his expression because she gave a small, humorless smirk. If you think they will come for me, you are wrong. What? Her ears flattened slightly, her tail curling closer around her. Because I was abandoned. Damon studied her, the weight of that admission sinking in. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was different. She wasn't just stranded, she had been left, just like he had. His grip tightened slightly around the hilt of his blade. Why? Zisha was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. Then finally she said, because I refuse to be weak. Damon frowned. That's a hell of a reason to leave someone behind. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Not to them. He didn't like the way that sounded. Zisha turned back to him, her golden eyes sharp despite the exhaustion still clinging to her features. And you? Your people? Damon exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. Same story, different ending. Her ears twitched. You were abandoned. No, he shook his head. I'd lost them. Something passed between them then, unspoken but understood. She didn't press. He didn't explain. Another breeze rolled through the jungle, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant flowers. The fire crackled softly between them, casting shadows along the stone walls. Zisha shifted slightly. wincing as she adjusted her injured side. Without thinking, Damon reached out, steadying her with a hand against her arm. Her entire body went still. His fingers brushed against her skin, warm, smooth, firm beneath his touch. Her golden eyes flickered to his, unreadable in the firelight. Damon didn't move, didn't let go. For the first time, she wasn't guarded, wasn't calculating. She was just there, caught in the same moment he was. He swallowed, his voice quieter now. "You okay?" Zisha didn't answer right away, then slowly she nodded. Damon started to pull his hand back, but before he could, Zisha's fingers wrapped around his wrist, stopping him. His heart kicked against his ribs. She wasn't pulling him closer, wasn't pushing him away, just holding him there, as if testing something, as if trying to decide where the line between hesitation and decision really was. Then, before either of them could break the silence, she leaned in. It was brief, barely more than a breath of contact, but it was intentional. Zisha's lips brushed against his, hesitant, searching, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them in that single heartbeat of a moment. Then she pulled away, her expression unreadable once more. Damon exhaled, his pulse still racing, his mind still catching up. "Well," he murmured, his voice rougher than before, "that's one way to say thanks." Zisha smirked, but there was something softer in it this time, something that hadn't been there before. "You talk too much," she muttered before shifting slightly closer, the warmth of her body brushing against his arm. Damon huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. This was dangerous, whatever this was, wherever it was going. It was dangerous, but for the first time since crashing onto this godforsaken planet, Damon didn't feel like a dead man walking. For the first time, he felt alive. The jungle stretched out in every direction, vast and untamed, illuminated by the pale glow of the twin moons overhead. The storm had passed, but its presence lingered in the dampness of the air, in the way the leaves still dripped with rain, in the fresh scent of earth and foliage that filled Damon's lungs. The fire between him and Zisha crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the stone walls of their temporary shelter. It had been 2 days since their first real moment of connection. A kiss, brief but intentional, unspoken yet undeniable. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been hesitation. It had been a choice. And Zisha had not distanced herself since. If anything, she had grown closer, not just physically, though that was the most obvious change. She stayed within arm's reach when they traveled. She walked beside him, not ahead or behind. She no longer kept her tail curled protectively around herself when she rested. Instead, it occasionally brushed against him, a silent reassurance that she was still there. There was a weight to this, something neither of them had acknowledged aloud, but both felt in the quiet moments between words. Damon wasn't sure what to do with it. He had lived his life without attachments. His time in the Terran Recon Corps had drilled into him the idea that nothing was permanent, not friendships, not missions, not even life itself. Bonds were fragile, people were lost, promises were broken. But Zisha wasn't fragile. She was a survivor, a fighter, a force wrapped in sharp instincts and fierce loyalty, and she had chosen him. Now he had to decide whether he would choose her back. Zisha sat across from him, tending to the small knife she had taken from him earlier, running her claws carefully over its edge, testing the sharpness. Her long white hair had dried, flowing freely over her shoulders, and her golden eyes reflected the firelight, flickering like molten metal. Damon leaned back against the rock, stretching out his legs, exhaling slowly. "You're awfully comfortable with my knife." Zisha smirked faintly, still inspecting the blade. "You were not using it." He raised an eyebrow. "I was." She tilted her head. "Not well." Damon scoffed. "So now you're an expert in human weapons." Zisha ran a single claw along the blade's edge, testing its sharpness. A weapon is only as useful as the hands that wield it. He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "And let me guess, you think your hands are better than mine." Her smirk deepened. "I know they are." Damon smirked back, watching the way she held his weapon with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting. There was something deeply captivating about her. He had known warriors before, but none like Zisha, none who looked at him the way she did now, none who called him mate. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So this whole life debt thing." Zisha's ears twitched at the shift in tone. "Yes?" He watched her carefully. "What exactly does that mean?" Zisha placed the knife down beside her, finally meeting his gaze fully. "It means I will not leave you, that I will fight for you, that I will kill for you." Her voice was steady, certain. There was no hesitation in her words, no doubt. To her, this wasn't something to question. It was simply fact. Damien let those words settle. He'd spent most of his life relying on himself, depending on no one. Now there was someone willing to stand beside him, fight for him, bleed for him, not because she had to, but because she had chosen to. And that terrified him more than anything. He forced himself to smirk, trying to lighten the weight pressing against his ribs. So does that make me your responsibility now? Zisha's tail flicked, a glint of amusement in her golden eyes. It makes you my mate. Damien felt something stir in his chest, something unfamiliar, something dangerous. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. You keep saying that. What does it actually mean? Zisha studied him for a moment, then exhaled, her voice quieter now. Among my kind, a life debt is not a simple thing, is not repaid with favors or words. It is a bond. It is a claim. Damien's smirk faded slightly. A claim. Zisha nodded. A vow. A promise. His throat felt dry. And what happens if I don't accept it? Zisha blinked slowly. Then I will wait until you do. The fire crackled between them, its warmth pressing against Damien's skin. But it wasn't the fire making his pulse quicken. It was the certainty in her voice, the absolute conviction in her words. She had already chosen. The question was, would he? Zisha tilted her head slightly. You do not wish to belong to someone. Damon let out a quiet breath, running a hand over his jaw. It's not that. It's just, I've never belonged to anyone before. Zisha watched him for a long moment, then shifted forward, closing the small space between them. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Then I will teach you what it means. Damien swallowed, his gaze locked on hers. She was close now, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin, close enough that her scent, earth, rain, something uniquely Zisha, filled his lungs. And then she did something unexpected. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, strong, but careful, as if she was giving him a chance to pull away. He didn't. Instead, he turned his hand slightly, intertwining their fingers. Zisha's ears twitched, her expression unreadable, but her tail curled slightly behind her, a silent acknowledgement of the moment between them. For the first time since he had crashed onto this planet, Damon felt grounded. Not lost, not waiting, just here with her. Zisha's voice was quiet when she spoke again. You are mine, Damon Ashford. A shiver ran down his spine at the way she said his name. Not a statement, not a question. A promise. Damien exhaled slowly, squeezing her hand just slightly. In your mind. Zisha's lips curved, not a smirk, not amusement, something deeper, something real. And as the jungle whispered around them, as the fire burned low, as the world outside remained vast and untamed, Damon knew whatever happened next, they would face it together. The jungle was different now, not in the way it looked. The bioluminescent flora still pulsed with eerie blue light, the canopy stretched endlessly overhead, and the distant calls of unseen creatures still echoed through the trees. But to Damien, something had shifted. The jungle no longer felt like a cage, a vast and unforgiving wilderness where survival was a daily struggle. It felt temporary. For the first time since crashing onto this planet, Damon had a way out. The distress beacon. He had barely thought about it before. What was the point? Even if it was still intact, it had been buried beneath the wreckage of the Argos for over a month. His team was gone. If there had been any chance of rescue, it would have come already. At least that's what he had convinced himself. But things were different now. Zisha was different, or maybe he was. They spent the past 2 days making their way through the jungle, moving toward the last known location of his ship. Zisha walked beside him, no longer keeping a wary distance as she had before. She trusted him now, in a way he hadn't expected, and in turn he had learned to trust her. She was no longer just a stranger, no longer just a warrior with sharp claws and sharper eyes. She was his, and he was hers. It was a thought that should have unnerved him, but instead it settled into his bones like something inevitable. The terrain grew rougher as they traveled, the trees thinning, giving way to jagged cliffs and rocky outcroppings. Damon recognized this place. He had passed through here before, back when he was searching for his crew, back when he had still hoped he wasn't alone. But now he wasn't. Zisha stopped suddenly, her ears twitching, her tail flicking in a way that told Damien she had sensed something. He didn't question it. He had learned quickly that when she reacted to something, it was best to listen. What is it? He asked, keeping his voice low. She didn't respond immediately, just lifted her chin slightly, inhaling. Her golden eyes scanned the rocky cliffs ahead, sharp and alert. We are not alone, she murmured. Damien's muscles tensed instinctively. Human. Zisha shook her head. Not human. That wasn't necessarily better. Damien slowly unshouldered his rifle, the one he had pieced together from salvage parts weeks ago. It wasn't in perfect condition, but it still worked, and right now that was enough. Zisha flexed her fingers, claws glinting in the dim light. They moved forward cautiously. The wreckage of the Argos came into view, a massive, twisted husk of metal half buried in the rocky terrain. Damon felt something tighten in his chest at the sight of it. He had crawled out of that wreckage alone, convinced that everyone else was either dead or missing. But the ship wasn't untouched. Something had been here.